I'll go ahead and do the introduction.
Go ahead.
Yes. Today we're honored to have with us Professor Melissa Dark, who is Professor and Assistant Dean in the School of Technology, also by courtesy in the Department of Computer Science, and long-standing, I don't know, founding member of CERIAS? Not quite founding member of CERIAS. Is one of the people who put education in CERIAS.
Pillar of CERIAS.
Yes, definitely a pillar of CERIAS. She is also a good example of the value of a Purdue education, having received her bachelor's, master's, and PhD here in the College of Education. So,
that's true.
Anyway,
Thanks, Chris.
turn it over to Professor Dark.
Thank you. Oh, come on in. So I'm Melissa Dark, and I'm a professor in computer and information technology. And I started at CERIAS in 2000. And I was there from full-time from 2000 until 2003 and a half. So the title of my talk is actually Multidisciplinary Perspectives in Information Assurance and Security. And you see I've got a colon there. So that's the broad part of my talk. And then the second part of my talk is bringing in those multidisciplinary perspectives to specifically show you a public policy aspect of information assurance and security. And we're going to focus on data breach disclosure policy in the United States because it's fairly recent. We've gone from 0 to 44 state data breach disclosure laws in 6 years' time, which is very rapid growth in public policy. Policy doesn't happen quickly. So that amount of policy and that amount of time is really pretty revolutionary. So a little bit about me. Chris Clifton said I started at CERIAS several years ago and was primarily working in information assurance and security education. That's true. And when I was working in the security education piece of it, I did a variety of things. And it ranged from producing multimedia materials and short courses that were used by business and industry. And if you go to the CERIAS website, you can still find a couple of examples of some of those products, even though by now, I'm sure some of the case studies that we used in the training and awareness materials are out of date. Security changes pretty fast. Also worked on some K-12 projects, and that ranged all the way from trying to help school corporations. In Indiana, we call them school corporations. They're really school districts, trying to help school corporations better secure their systems. As you know, a lot of educational institutions have systems that are fairly wide open. That includes universities. It also includes K-12 school districts. And then a little bit of work in trying to get information assurance and security integrated into the high school curriculum in places where it would make sense. But the majority of my work when I worked in security education was working with colleges and universities from across the country, trying to help them develop programs of study courses in information security. So I had some DoD funding that ran some faculty curriculum development projects, developed over 200 security courses that were integrated into colleges and universities. And after 3 years of the project, it had affected about 10,000 students. And then I quit keeping track of the number of students affected. You can only do that so long. So security education, I think, has been used in a preventative way. And the notion is that if you can better educate people, and by people we could be talking about systems designers, we could be talking about developers, we could be talking about implementers, we could be talking about policymakers, we could be talking about users. So I mean people very globally. If you could better educate people, they would make better decisions. And if they would make better decisions, we would have an improved state of security. That's the notion behind almost all of the educational efforts, far beyond CERIAS's efforts. So embedded in there are a couple of words. One is better. People would make better choices. And better is usually value-driven. And so it was that notion of better choices that led me to start looking at, well, from what base do they make better choices? Why do they make bad choices or less good choices? What's driving their sense of better? And that's what led me to my work in information assurance and security ethics. Ethics is a field that's divided into microethics. Well, you can divide it lots of ways. One way is microethics and macroethics. Microethics are the ethics that all of us have in making our own individual decisions. Macroethics are things that become societal issues. It's no longer just a matter of how I teach you to make a decision about right and wrong so that you're a better information security officer or privacy officer. It becomes, how is this issue, this societal issue, this ethical issue, an issue for large groups of people? Most macroethical issues are shaped by public policy or shaped by economics. And so it was that leap that then started getting me interested in public policy. Much of public policy is closely aligned to economics. And it's closely aligned to that branch of economics that is sometimes called welfare economics. And by welfare, we don't mean food stamps. We mean things that policy positions and decisions that improve social welfare or social well-being, and the economic tools that go along with analyzing that. So that's the path that I've been traveling that led me here today to talk to you a little bit about these multidisciplinary perspectives. I need to start, I think, with a few basic principles. The first one is that information assurance and security, in my opinion, is inherently normative. And I know that sometimes from a technology-centric position, we tend to think of technology as being value neutral. Technology doesn't have values embedded in it. It's stuff. But I would contend that technology is developed by people and enabled by policy sometimes that directs funds. And there are values behind those decisions. So I don't think that we can say that there are not value associations. And then when you look at many of the issues that information assurance and security is about, privacy, access, ownership, intellectual property, cybercrime, usually at the intersection of those issues are questions about what ought we do? What should we do? And ought and should are normative words. They're about norms, they're about values. Normative thinking, to just add a little bit more to round it out, can be contrasted to positivistic thinking. You know, the goal of positivistic thinking is to describe or explain something. So you usually have factual statements. Those factual statements can range from being quite simple to quite elaborate and sophisticated. Normative statements, it's possible to make factual statements about norms. You know, I could give a survey right now, ask you a series of questions about your ethics, and I could describe the ethics of this group. So I could make positivistic statements about ethics. But inherently what you're trying to do in normative fields is make decisions about ought and should, about societal choices. So normative thinking runs through a variety of fields. Normative ethics, obviously. I've already talked about that. How ought one act? There's a branch of economics that's called normative economics that is focused on what ought the economy be like. And you can then extend that to say, well, what ought it be like to support what priorities? What ought it be like to support national security? What ought it be like to promote social well-being? So that's the branch of economics that is about ought. Jurisprudence, we have a legal system, we have legal reasoning, and jurisprudence is that area of study in the law that asks, well, what is the law? But let's go beyond that and ask, what should it be and why? And then political philosophy. Political science is divided generally into three areas. Political philosophy, which is what should our political systems be like to enhance human flourishing. Political science is descriptive, what are they like? And policy analysis is, now that it's implemented, what's the effect? Okay? But you see how norms run across a variety of fields. And there's one more big idea that I need to just briefly touch on, and that's this idea of structuration. This is the idea of Anthony Giddens. This idea was put forward in a book he published in 1984 called The Constitution of Society. Giddens is still a professor. He's at the London School of Economics. And the big idea here, which turned some of social science on its head, and so that influenced economics, and that influenced policy and political philosophy, law. The big idea that Giddens put forward with structuration is that social decisions are not just a dichotomy. Almost all approaches up to this idea of structuration either looked at agents, how do people make decisions, what drives them, what motivates them, or it looked at structures, institutions. And by institutions, we mean large social structures such as markets, government, civil society, cultures, norms embedded in those cultures. So the thinking up to Giddens had been to focus on either one or the other. And Giddens came along and he said, wait, there's a co-generational relationship here. Structures, markets, norms, civil society, they influence how people act, but people constitute structures, markets, and norms. And because people constitute them, they can transform them. So there's a co-adaptive, complex relationship, and what he's after is the things that transcend time and space. So that's what you're looking for when you take a structurational approach to studying something. And I'm trying to take this paradigm and look at public policy and information assurance and security. So structuration is important. So to recap that brief tour of multidisciplinary perspectives, I believe norms are an integral part of human life. Norms will vary greatly by people, by cultures. They're conveyed and enacted through multiple social structures, and I've already mentioned a few of those large social structures. These structures shape norms, and generative action is not only possible but constantly underway, so that people are in turn reciprocally shaping the structures. And I believe that any field that finds itself confronted with questions of ought and should, which includes information assurance and security in my definition, has to consider norm-maintaining structures as well as shifts in social structure and shifts in those norms. And so when I think of information assurance and security, I view it like this. And I'm probably leaving out some big areas. But I think it's partly about technology. I think it's partly about policy. It's partly about culture. I think it's partly about economics. And when I think about the macro ethical issues confronting us, for example, privacy, ownership, I think it lies at the intersection of these co-constitutive relationships that are, in fact, changing. And these are a lot of questions that one could ask. And they're huge questions, right? If you think of information assurance and security in that diagram that I just had up, you could ask things like, well, what is the nature of the relationships among technology, policy, economics, and culture in information assurance and security? How does culture affect what policy gets implemented, and how does that affect the state of assurance and security? How does economics influence what technology gets developed? And how does that influence the state of assurance and security? If you look at policies, public policies, I don't mean organizational policies, I mean public policies. If you look at the public policies that we have, why do we have the ones we have? And we're going to get into some of them in just a little bit. Why do we have those and not some others? Why have certain issues seen the light of day on the legislative agenda while others have not? Why, given all of the challenges that we are currently having with file sharing and ownership rights to movies, to music, why do we continue to have that policy? Is that the best policy position in 2009? Did anybody go to Robert McLaughlin's talk last night? Scientific Reasoning and the Closing of the American Mind? I didn't either, but it was related to this. So a lot of the position that we have comes out of our long history of property rights in the United States. And so we've tried to extend all of that to intellectual property. And sometimes the extension works and sometimes it falls a bit short. How do economic constituencies interact with regard to information assurance and security? And I'm sure you can understand that these are not just US-centric questions. You know, we live in a global environment. You know, how do our policies, how does our economic approach to running our country conflict internationally? Gosh, are our existing policies meeting our well-being needs? To what extent? You know, these are huge, huge questions. And I'm sure that if we had time, we could brainstorm a lot more, you know, a lot more and questions at the bottom of this. And it's almost overwhelming when you start getting those big questions out in front of you. It's almost overwhelming. So, you know, one always has to start someplace. And so you pull it back in and find a starting place that you think, if I could gain some insight here, then perhaps I could get up on top of the horizon and see a little further that would help me provide further insight into some of those other questions. So my starting point is data breach. Data breach disclosure, I already mentioned that. Why this starting point? Well, we do have a spate of data breach disclosure laws enacted in the last 6 years in our country. There's some controversy over them, over whether they're the right laws or not. In the 109th and 110th Congress, We had 6 federal preemptive laws die, some of them House bills, some of them Senate bills, on the floor of the Congress. And in the face of all of this legislative activity, we have problems that these laws are intended to produce that are still propagating. One problem is identity theft. Data breach disclosure is partly about identity theft. According to Javelin, in a 2007 publication, 8.4 million U.S. adult victims of identity fraud in 2007. And according to Javelin, those losses totaled $49.3 billion. Now, that might be a high estimate. Poneman Institute came out with a study in 2007 that said the average cost of a data breach was $197 per record. And then the Electronic Privacy Rights Clearinghouse, I went and I counted up, you know how they're always putting the log of records breached. So I just looked at the total for 2008, 35 million. So if we look at the Privacy Rights Clearinghouse and Poneman Institute, and we just take 35 million times 197, and we assume that the cost stayed at $197 for 2008, we won't inflate, okay, just for simplicity, then losses are actually about 6.6 billion. So losses are somewhere between 6.6 billion and 49.3, big range. And who knows? You know, maybe if we put together some other numbers, we would come up with a different figure. Clearly, there's economic cost to identity theft. So we can start to use the cost of identity theft to look at, well, if we have data breach disclosure laws and they start to reduce identity theft or keep it current, then maybe we can back into some numbers about the benefit, the financial benefit of those laws. Okay? And we're going to come back to this aspect of it. But we don't only have data breach laws for identity theft. We also have data breach because we're hoping to sort of stem the erosion in the tide of our privacy. And privacy, if it's hard to metricize data breach loss, 6.6 billion to 49.3.
One question on that difference is the Javelin study, because the Poneman study...
Microphone, please.
The Poneman study, I believe, was the cost to a company of things like complying with disclosure laws or customer churn after the disclosure.
They have a couple of different studies, Poneman does.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what I thought the 197 came from, whereas I was wondering if the Javelin study was looking at the cost to the consumer whose identity was stolen, and whether that was included just identity theft because there was a data breach someplace, or if it was identity theft, you know, maybe because the consumer spouted out their information.
And everything that you bring up is a great point. And we'll come back to this at the very end, that metricizing any of the costs and the benefits is extremely challenging in analyzing the policy effectiveness.
Agreed.
Yeah, it's very challenging. But my point was just that you do see wide ranges. And I'm sure you've seen some of them. It's even harder to get your hands around valuing privacy. It's very, very difficult. There's no single meaning, there's no one definition, a few common definitions, and I know you all have seen these definitions over and over again. You know, the condition of being left alone. How do you put an economic value to that? Even if we could put an economic value to it, how would we collect from everybody the value to them and aggregate that to come up with a cost? or a benefit. Would be hard to do. It would almost cost us more to collect it than it, might be worth. Out of public view and control of information about oneself. And I'm sure you've seen other definitions. My point here is just that it's very difficult to value. Some people tend to think that even if you could come up with one definition, that maybe privacy is more than the sum of its parts. And this is the idea of coherentist notions, that together all of these things have interaction effects, and it's those interaction effects that really are eroding our privacy. And that's what we have to try to get our hands around. And I just put up here, just so you know, that not everyone believes that there are interaction effects. There are policy positions that say, no, we don't need unique privacy laws. We have trespass laws, we have property rights laws, and all we need to do is extend those and apply those to the challenges. So there are people you'll run across that have this reductionist perspective. So we needed to just lay a few more pieces of groundwork before I can talk about the study that I'm currently trying to make headway on. Now, there's really no provision for privacy in the U.S. Constitution. We don't have an independent privacy oversight agency. We don't have a comprehensive privacy law in the United States. We have this patchwork. And the patchwork includes the 44 state laws, but includes some other laws. So I wanted to back up and address some of those just a little bit. So the Federal Trade Commission Act was established established the FTC in 1914 with the goal of promoting consumer protection and eliminating and preventing anti-competitive business practices. Section 5 of that act has been used in security and assurance and in data breach. It was used in the Choice Point case. And the act was amended in 2003. And the portion of it that is the result of that amendment is the Fair and Accurate Transactions Act. And it specifically is there to provide for the privacy of a consumer's credit-related data. Okay, so we've got one piece. 1974, the Privacy Act. The Privacy Act governs the federal government's information privacy program, the federal government in the United States. Tries to balance government's need to maintain records about its citizens with our need as citizens for privacy. This act came about after abuses of privacy by Richard Nixon. It applies to governmental databases and databases of contractors. There's another government law, you may be familiar with it, FISMA, the Federal Information Security Management Act. It provides for the information security program for the federal government. You've probably seen some of those reports. You know, blah, blah, blah agency gets a D. They give them grades, or they used to a couple years ago. Maybe they quit giving grades. I bet you wish people would quit giving grades. It is looking for the development and implementation of programs commensurate with risk. If you have been involved at all in risk analysis and information security, you know that this is a little bit of a slippery slope. We don't have good risk metrics, and now we're talking about building programs that comply with public policy based on those risk metrics. So that's a challenge. It does include requirements for detection as well as reporting and responding. It does include a breach disclosure aspect that became a little bit more specific in 2007. And again, it only applies to government systems or government contractor systems. kind of a one-off here is the Veterans Affairs Information Security Act. This came about specifically because of one breach, a breach that compromised the records of 26.5 million veterans in the same year. It does apply to veterans' records. It's not clear whether we would have had sufficient legislation with FSMA already. You know, was this really needed? So it is a sort of a one-off. And then we have two big private sector laws. And I know that you know them, but maybe I'll tell you something a little new about them. We'll see. HIPAA is the Health Insurance, not Health Information, Health Insurance, Portability and Accountability Act. Two main titles. The first one is to regulate the availability and breadth of group health plans, to limit restrictions that a group health plan can place on benefits for pre-existing conditions. This is largely to allow people to change jobs or to not have to remain in the same job because of fear of losing their health insurance. So, Title II has some provisions for fraud and abuse within the healthcare system. And it is in Title II that you see the administrative simplifications, and that includes the privacy rule and the security rule. But my point is that we really have the privacy rule and the security rule because we needed to have a job mobility law. Graeme, Leach, Bleiley, Financial Services Modernization Act, 1999. This act repealed part of a former act, the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. The Glass-Steagall Act prohibited a bank from offering investment, commercial banking, insurance services. So it kept some of our financial services separate. And what Graeme, Leach, Bleiley did was legalize mergers on a permanent basis. So it was really a Financial Services Modernization Act. Covered a lot of entities, non-bank mortgage lenders, loan brokers, debt collectors, tax return preparers. And what was going on is people were saying, wait, you're now going to have, one entity is now going to have all sorts of pieces of personal information about me. And so you saw the financial privacy rule and a safeguards rule. The privacy rule is exactly that, a privacy rule. Safeguard rule is similar to the FSMA, which calls for these financial services organizations to have information security programs that do monitoring, detection, prevention, response, and data breach disclosure. And there's specifically in this one a pretexting protection. Very similar story to HIPAA. You saw privacy and information security safeguards being put in because we needed financial services modernization. And that brings us to the 44 state laws. Here are the states without laws, in case you were curious. And there's the trend in when they were enacted. So you see almost half of them in 2006. California, as most of you probably know, was the first in 2003. Alaska's was the last to take effect in January of this year. So these state laws, they pertain to a lot of entities. They pertain to businesses. They pertain to community hospitals that might not necessarily be covered by HIPAA. They pertain to local election boards, schools, universities. And it sort of follows the trend that we have seen in other areas, such as education, where education in our country, public policy for education is largely delegated to states. federal money comes, it comes often in block grants to states, and states make decisions. States set a lot of education policy. And so these 44 data breach disclosure laws have followed that same trend, you know, that in some regards we're a federation of states, and states need to have the ability to govern themselves. That's some of the thinking behind having 44 state laws. There's benefits to that, there are costs to that. So these state laws, they're not the same. There are differences among them. So this further adds to the patchwork, right? We've got the FTC Act, we've got the privacy rule, we've got FISMA, we've got the Veterans Affairs, we've got Graeme, Leach, Bleiley, we've got HIPAA, and now we have 44 state laws that have differences. They do have commonalities. All of the 44 state laws include a provision for personal information. All of them spell out notification requirements. All of them spell out notification procedures and a timeline. But like everything, the devil is in the details, and that's where the differences are. There's not a consistent definition across all of them about what personal information is. There's not a consistent definition about a breach, what a breach is. There's not a consistent definition. In some cases, some of them provide safe harbor. You don't have to disclose that there was a breach if the data were encrypted, but they don't call out encryption standards. That's left to the, you know, right to the judgment of the breached company, agency, entity. Potential risk is not defined. We've already discussed risk is difficult in this field. So what we see is that any interstate entity, and that includes like Purdue University, can be forced to comply with multiple state laws. And this can be cumbersome, it can be costly. Sometimes the entity chooses to just comply with the most stringent, because if we comply with the most stringent, then we're compliant with all of the others. That too could be costly. Maybe you're having to do more. How do you evaluate that? So a few of the differences, all 44 covers 6 things in personal information. Social security number, driver's license number, state ID number, and these 3 types of financial account numbers, as long as it's also in combination with an access code, a security code, a password. But then they start to vary. They vary. Some of them cover PIN numbers, some of them cover date of birth, medical information, biometric data, genomic data. Okay, so there are some commonalities, but then differences. Notification requirements. About half of the data breach 44 laws, about half of them are acquisition-based. If the data were acquired, the entity is required to report it. About half of them are risk-based, meaning if the data were acquired and they determined that there's a reasonable risk, reasonable likelihood of harm or injury, then they have to report it. We've already talked about the difficulty with reasonable likelihood of risk, harm. It's a judgment call for them. I already talked a little bit about the encryption standards. Covered entities, all of the laws pertain to entities that own or license data. About half of them, half of the state laws, pertain to entities that maintain computerized data. Can you hear me buzzing? I'm sorry if you can. It's children calling me. And then in some cases, they pertain to government agencies that are not covered by federal laws. So it could be local government, county government, that kind of thing. So there are differences there. Then there are differences in notification procedures and timeline. This is how individuals are to be notified and in what circumstance. Almost all of them allow for notification by email and letter. Believe it or not, Indiana allows for notification by fax. I don't know how that got in there. Some allow for substitute notice, because you can imagine if it's a large number of records that were breached, a large number of people that you have to notify, it could get costly pretty quick. So some allow website posting or the use of statewide media to make notification. Usually these are based on thresholds, and the thresholds vary. In some states it's based on cost, and the range is anywhere from, if it's going to cost you $2,500, you can use website posting or statewide media, to $250,000. Some are based on number of people affected, where the people affected are just the residents of that state. So if 5,000 residents, Indiana residents were affected, then you can use website or statewide media, and the upper range is 500,000. Big range in time delay. Some are a discrete amount of time. The most stringent are a discrete amount of time, all the way from most expedient time possible. In some cases, it's the consumer only who is notified. In some cases, it's the consumer plus some state agency, an attorney general, the state police, the Department of Justice. And they vary in a few other ways. So some of the state laws are not just data breach disclosure laws. Some of them are information security laws. If you have a data breach disclosure, then you have to do certain things remedially to make sure it doesn't happen again. Some allow security freezes. Call out the request that you inform consumers about security freezes, credit freezes. They vary in penalty. Some states allow private right of action, while others rely on the Attorney General. There's a wide range of penalties. You know, it's as low as $100 a record to, gosh, the upper limit, I might not be able to find it here quickly because I haven't been turning my notes pages. $100 per occurrence, no more than $25,000 adjudged against any one defendant where the defendant is the entity that was breached. To $150,000 as a maximum breach, to $500 per defendant, and $500,000 as a maximum penalty. So again, it's a big range. So the challenge is for these companies, these entities, to try to comply and to try to comply with a number of different laws. But beyond the challenge for companies complying, I think we have to come back and ask ourselves the question, how efficacious are these policies? Are they making an impact on identity theft? Are they making an impact on privacy? And if so, how? Just to add one more piece of information that's important to understanding the data breach disclosure policies that we have. In 1966, the U.S. passed the Freedom of Information Act. This is a sunshine law. Sunshine law is just that. It intends to shine light on an issue. So sunshine laws are usually embraced by democratic nations. They are based upon the notion that a democracy requires open access, it requires citizen participation, and that a right to know is an inherent right of its citizens. So 8 years later, we had the Privacy Act. And I guess I just wanted to point out, we already talked a little bit about the Privacy Act being in response to the problems with the Nixon administration. Both of these laws reflect a suspicion of government, whether it's a sunshine law, which is a positive law, or a Privacy Act in reaction to the Nixon administration. Both of them reflect suspicion of government power. And neither of them really reflect privacy as a positive right. And that's true of the position in the United States. In all of our public policy, we really haven't reflected policy as a privacy right. And I already said this, I just want to repeat it one more time quickly. You know, privacy in Graeme, Leach, Bleiley, and Hippo, they were treated as a means to an end. Privacy has a functional role. We need privacy because we need job mobility. We need privacy because we need financial services modernization. So does that mean if we didn't need financial services modernization or we didn't need job mobility, we wouldn't need privacy? No, I don't think it means that. It means that we have this interesting history in the United States of attaching, glomming privacy onto something else. You know, and it's hard, and that's what's happening partly right now in data breach and identity theft. And it's a long-standing trend that might be hard for us to reverse, you know, but that I think we need to recognize as the policy posture of the United States. Maybe it will change, but I do think we have to recognize it as a policy posture currently. So data breach disclosure is a form of regulation that's called informational regulation. It goes along with the notion of sunshine laws, that our citizens have a right to know. So informational regulation is a growing trend in the United States. It's growing partially because it's not command and control regulation. So it puts the burden on consumers instead of growing government. Command and control regulation can be costly. It can mean big government. And we tend to not like that in the US. So it serves to try to inform people of risk exposures. And it assumes by informing people of risk exposures that they will then be informed, that they will then take action, and that action that they take will change the behavior of risk producers. So I'll use a simple example, which is in the food industry. We have labeling laws that require the food industry to disclose what's in the food you buy at the grocery store, what's in that McDonald's hamburger, how much fat. Sometimes you get some of it at other types of restaurants, they tell you. And so the notion here is that, you know, I go to the grocery store and I'm going to buy salad dressing, and I look at that salad dressing bottle and I think, geez, I don't need 13 grams of fat and, you know, X grams of sugar. And so I buy this one over here. And over time, this one doesn't get bought because collectively we don't want it to display this risky behavior. And over time, the producer gets the message that they're not going to buy that. And the producer changes their behavior. That's the logic behind them. The logic behind them is also partially that they improve democratic processes and individual autonomy, values that we hold dear in the United States. At a much more pragmatic level, good information regulation in order for it to be able to mobilize consumers to take action, it's got to be accurate. It's got to be well conveyed. People have to be able to get that message, attend to that message, and know what action to take. And it is very possible that the information provided is ineffective. That as a result of getting this notice, you don't know what it says or what to do. What might happen? Well, people could underreact, they could overreact. And if they underreact, if the first part of the equation isn't working, then the second part of the equation can't work, right? But I think in information security, we have to ask ourselves another question. If your credit card number was breached at TJ Maxx, TJ Maxx is also a victim, aren't they? I mean, they could do certain things to put in certain security measures, but they're not really a producer in the same way that information regulation works in the health example, the food industry example I just provided you. So what? So where are we? So where I am is that I'm looking to see, does information regulation work in data breach disclosure? You know, it's supposed to control the costs of government through the use of market mechanisms. Are those market mechanisms working? It's supposed to use market mechanisms to create a competitive equilibrium to shift the economic supply and demand so that we are efficiently allocating our resources in a way that increases our social utility, our well-being. Is that happening? Is it reducing identity theft? Is it causing consumers to act any different? Even if it is causing us to act different, is that really changing privacy erosion? That's a big question, a hard to answer question, I think. So those are the motivating questions. I think these are too big to answer. These are the motivating questions. And where I am in a more practical way is to look at the costs and the benefits of these policies and the consequent social welfare effects. And I'm focusing just right now on Indiana and trying to look at the conditions under which mandatory information disclosure would lead to a reduction in identity theft and an enhancement of privacy. So questions like, do consumers decide to reduce or withdraw from consuming goods and services of a firm that has suffered a breach? There is some, as Professor Clifton pointed out earlier, there is some information out on this, but right now it's coming mostly from a single source. Not a lot of studies. Do investors shun the stock of these firms? What are the costs, to these people? Do consumers react differently toward profit-driven firms as opposed to non-profit-driven firms? Remember that these data breach disclosure laws apply to nonprofits as well. Are there differences in consumer reactions by different groups, demographic variables? So I'm trying to work my way towards establishing indicators of consumer loss and surplus in this area. So my goal today was to hopefully provide you with a different perspective. I don't know all of the topics that you've had covered this semester, but to provide you with a different perspective on information assurance and security research, and specifically one that is public policy focused, based on my view of information assurance and security as being multidisciplinary. And thank you. I went past it, didn't I? Thank you, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And I did put my email address at the very last slide, dark@purdue.edu. In case you're interested, have questions or comments for me later. Thanks.